In the last lecture module, we looked at the epistemic regress argument. You'll recall that when I outlined what I wanted to do in dealing with that first thesis of BonJour's in our lecture here, I said I wanted to look at the epistemic regress argument, and then I also wanted to broaden the context and consider another regress argument so that we could see how these regress arguments have a common strategy and a common mechanism. So they have a mechanism for generating the regresses and a strategy for using these generated regresses to come to their conclusions. So we'll look at the cosmological argument, another instance of the regress argument, and use it to sort of pull out these abstract features of this kind of argument. When we think about the cosmological or first cause argument, we usually think of St. Thomas Aquinas, at least within the Western theological and philosophy of religion tradition. But versions of this argument date back at least to Plato's laws and to Aristotle's metaphysics. And in fact, these arguments were refined and variations were introduced during the Islamic Golden Age by Islamic philosophers like this person here, whose name I'm definitely probably going to mispronounce, Ibn Sina, who was a Persian polymath and philosopher during the Islamic Golden Age, and who is thought to be at least one of the first, if not the first person to introduce a contingent version of this kind of argument. So let's look at the argument. We start off by saying, look, the universe is constantly changing. So we assume some fact about the world. In this case, we assume that the world is dynamic and changing. In our epistemic regress, we did the same thing. We started off by assuming that there were beliefs that we could have that were justified, or there were beliefs that counted as knowledge. Now we take this fact about the world, and our next assumption introduces a principle that would purport to explain that fact. So in our cosmological argument, we have here on C2, change requires the existence prior to the change of a cause sufficient to bring about the change. So a sort of causally oriented principle sufficient reason. In our epistemic regress argument, we introduce this principle of justifying beliefs via transfer of justification through inference, so that we have a belief that's justified, then it gets its justification by being inferred from another belief or beliefs that are justified, and in doing so they can transfer their justification to that target belief through the process of inferring it. So here we also have that, a fact about the world, a principle that would purport to explain how that fact comes about or what makes that true about the world. So now we can conclude here on C3, no change causes itself, since it cannot exist prior to its existence. Now, interestingly enough, both the epistemic regress argument and the cosmological argument both want to establish that there's at least one instance, one individual or one well-defined class of things that violate that general principle that they introduce. And they motivate that by arguing that otherwise there really is no explanation of that principle, because the regress prevents the explanation from ever really sort of coming to fruition. And so here in C3, what we find is that we're assuming, basically for the purposes of denial, that our principle has no exceptions, that C2 is true for every change. Every change has a cause, every cause is a change, and hence it too needs a cause, according to our principle. So in C4, we spell that out in some detail. So to explain the current state of the universe, we would have to posit an infinite number of causes, since each prior cause would also have a cause. So we go, look, take any state of the universe. The universe is constantly changing. Here's a change. That change, how do we understand that? How do we explain it? Well, it has to have been caused by a cause that existed prior to its existence and that was sufficient to bring it about. All right, well, let's look at that one. Okay, it is a cause right? But it's also an effect, it's a change. And so we have to explain how it came about. And we do that by invoking C2 again. And what we realize then is that the principle doesn't have a way of ending that explanatory appeal. And we found the same thing with our epistemic regress argument. So our belief can be justified via transference of justification through inference, so that our belief can get its justification by being inferred from a previous belief that was already justified. Oh, but now we have to understand how that belief got its justification. Well, we just invoke that principle again. It was inferred from other beliefs that were justified, and they transferred their justification. Oh, well, now we have to explain that justification, and so on. And so in the cosmological argument, in the epistemic regress argument, we have this fact, we have a mechanism for explaining the fact, and then we draw out that that mechanism cannot bring explanation to fruition precisely because it creates this never-ending regress. Every step in the explanation calls out for another iteration of the explanation itself. An infinite number of causes could not have occurred before the state of the universe, since an infinite series has no end and a causal series ends. So we then say, look, this can't be the case, right? We've posited this principle. This principle is supposed to explain this fact about the world. Turns out that the principle never actually comes to fruition. Its explanation never really ends. It always results in an iteration, a further iteration of that principle. And so it looks like it doesn't really explain anything at all. But it's got to be a correct principle. So what should we do? Well, in C6 here in our cosmological argument, we say, well, there has to be at least one thing that violates that principle and that brings the explanation series to an end. And so there must be an uncaused God, an uncaused cause. And in the case of the cosmological or first cause argument, that uncaused cause then gets equated with the deity. But again, it's established because it's supposed that we need to have that single violation. In this case, there could only be one. It's such an important principle, that C2 principle of sufficient reason. There has to be this violation of that principle in order for the principle to do any explanatory work at all, right? And so it's then supposed that we justify the violation of the principle by supposing the fact about the world, the principle that explains that fact, and then by noting that we have to have that principle violated at least once in order for it to explain that fact. And we found the same thing with our epistemic regress argument. So justification transference via inference, that never ends. So there's never any point at which we say, and so the justification, right, can be seen to originate here. So we have to suppose, right, that in order to explain the justification of these beliefs via that principle of transference of justification through inference, that they have to come to a point in that chain of inference where we find beliefs that no longer require that principle to be justified, that are self-justifying, in the same way that we have this entity that is an uncaused cause. So we have to suppose there's a violation. Now, in the case of our epistemic regress argument, the violation is a class or a kind of thing, whereas in the first cause argument, it's just a single thing, at least this versions that are adopted within religion. Now, BonJour doesn't say this, but I think this is what we should understand after thinking about the regress argument, and then how do we want to understand the regress problem. So, as with all regress arguments, the mechanism, the principle or assumption that introduces the regress, right, in our epistemic regress argument prohibits that mechanism from terminating the regress. It in and of itself can't bring the explanation of the feature of the world to fruition. It never really culminates. And so the epistemic regress argument then understands and defines inference as a mechanism through which justification gets transferred through inference from an antecedently justified belief to a subsequent belief through that mechanism of inference. Inference can't create novel justification as a result. It can only propagate already existent justification. And so we can think of the regress problem as a result of consisting in the problem of explaining or understanding how novel justification originates, and a recognition that the principle, that is of inferential transference of justification, can't explain anything without the supposition, without the solution to this problem, whereby we get novel justification.